Tonight, we quietly step into another time. Not a time of great events or famous names, but a time of slow roads and wooden wheels, of dust settling on cloaks at the end of a long afternoon, of the particular kind of hunger that only comes after many hours of moving through open land. It is a time when a journey was not simply a matter of hours, but of days, sometimes weeks, and when the food carried along the way was as important as any map or compass. So come, softly. There is no urgency here. There is only the road and the people on it and the meals they ate along the way. Close your eyes if you like, or let them grow heavy as we walk together, very slowly, into this other world. The morning begins before the light is fully awake. Somewhere in the middle of what is now called Europe, in a time several centuries before the one we know, the air just before dawn carries a particular coldness that is not quite harsh, not quite gentle. It is simply the cold of early hours in a world without heated rooms or electric light, the kind of cold that sits in fabric and in hair and in the wooden boards of a small inn where travelers have slept 3 or 4 to a room, wrapped in cloaks and wool blankets, listening in their half-sleep to the sound of horses shifting in the stable below. The inn is a modest building. Its walls are made of stone on the lower half and timber above, and the roof is low, and the ceilings are low, and the rooms are small, and everything about it has the feeling of something built to be practical rather than beautiful. But it is warm enough, or it was warm enough through the night, because the innkeeper left a low fire burning in the hearth at the center of the common room downstairs, and some of that warmth drifted up through the floorboards in a slow, invisible way. Not much changes in these first minutes of morning. The travelers sleep, or they lie quietly in that place between sleeping and waking, where thoughts come slowly and the body is still heavy. Outside, the road is empty. The village attached to this inn is just beginning to stir, a rooster calling somewhere far away, a dog answering him briefly before going quiet again. Slowly, the light begins to change. It is not dramatic, this change. It is the kind of light that simply arrives, as if it has been there all along and is only now making itself known. The windows of the inn, which are small and covered with oiled cloth rather than glass, let in a pale and filtered brightness that spreads across the floor in soft rectangles, touching the edge of a boot here, the corner of a traveling bag there. Downstairs, the innkeeper's wife is already moving. She is a woman of middle age, broad-shouldered and quiet in her movements, someone who has been awake before dawn for so many years that her body simply opens its eyes at the same hour without being asked. She stirs the fire first, adding a few pieces of wood from the pile beside the hearth, watching the coals beneath catch and glow and finally produce a real flame. Then she goes to the kitchen, which is a small room off the back of the common room, and she begins to prepare the morning meal. The morning meal for travelers in this time is not a complex affair. It is, in fact, quite simple, and its simplicity is one of its comforts. There is bread from the day before, which has been wrapped in a cloth and kept near the warmth of the dying fire, so that it did not grow too hard overnight. There is a pot of something thick, a kind of porridge made from oats or millet that was set to soak before she went to bed, and now she hangs it over the fire and stirs it slowly with a long wooden spoon. There is perhaps a small piece of hard cheese, and if there are eggs, she may boil a few of them in water alongside the porridge pot. She does not rush any of this. There is a rhythm to it, and the rhythm is slow and familiar, and the sound of the spoon against the inside of the clay pot is a sound she has made hundreds of times, perhaps thousands, and it carries no particular meaning except the quiet meaning of nourishment being prepared for people who will need it before they go back out into the world. The smell of the porridge begins to drift upward through those same floorboards where the warmth traveled in the night, and one by one the travelers begin to stir. Let us follow one group of them, quietly, without disturbing them too much. There are 4 people in this particular party: a merchant, a man of perhaps 50 years, who is traveling between 2 market towns with a covered cart full of cloth, linen mostly, folded and wrapped and tied with cord, because linen was valuable in this period and worth the trouble of moving it over long distances. With him is his apprentice, a young man of 17 or 18, who has been making this particular journey twice a year for the last 3 years, and who has learned by now not to complain about sore legs or bad weather, at least not out loud. Then there is a woman traveling with her adult daughter, both wrapped in dark wool traveling cloaks, both quiet by nature or made quiet by the length of this particular journey, which has already been going on for 5 days and will continue for 4 or 5 more. They do not necessarily know each other well. They have shared this inn for the night because it is the only inn on this stretch of road, and because there is safety in numbers when traveling through unfamiliar stretches of land, and because the cost of the room is divided when there are more of you. This was not unusual. Travelers in this time often found themselves in the company of strangers and simply absorbed each other's presence quietly, sharing roads and meals and fire without particularly talking much, the way people do when they are tired and moving through a world that requires most of their attention just for the basic tasks of continuing to move through it. They come downstairs one by one and find their places at the long wooden table in the common room, and the innkeeper's wife brings the porridge in a large clay bowl set in the center of the table, alongside the bread and a small jug of something to drink, water mixed with a little vinegar and perhaps a small amount of something fermented, because clean water was not always easy to trust, and people had learned to add things to it that would make it safer, though they did not think of it in those terms. They simply knew that the water with the vinegar tasted different from plain water, and that you were less likely to feel ill after drinking it. The porridge is ladled into shallow wooden bowls. It is thick and slightly gray, with a faint smell of oats and wood smoke, and it is eaten with a wooden spoon, or simply by tilting the bowl and drinking from the edge. There is no decoration to it, no spices that the travelers have access to at this modest inn, though the innkeeper's wife may have added a pinch of salt if she had it, or perhaps a small amount of dried herb, something like thyme or marjoram, that she keeps in a small clay pot near the fire. The bread is torn rather than cut, each person pulling a piece from the loaf, and it is chewed slowly because old bread requires slow chewing, and because the travelers are not yet fully awake, and there is no reason to rush. The fire is burning well by now, and its warmth fills the small room, and the light from outside has grown enough that the oiled cloth on the windows is translucent and golden, and the room has the particular quality of a place that is both inside and outside at once, warm enough to stay in, but bright enough to remind you that the road is waiting. Gently, one by one, they finish eating. The porridge bowl is scraped clean. The bread is gone. The jug of vinegared water is passed around once more, and each person takes a small amount, and then the jug is set back on the table, and there is a moment of stillness before anyone speaks or moves. Preparing for the road again takes time that we might not expect. The traveling bags must be repacked, not because they were fully unpacked during the night, but because a few things were taken out, a change of linen perhaps, or a small personal item, or the food that each traveler carries for themselves for the road, and this must be reorganized, the heavier items settled at the bottom, the food wrapped carefully at the top where it can be reached without unpacking everything. The merchant checks his cart. The cloth is still there, still dry, still tied where he tied it the night before. His horse, or his mule, depending on what he could afford, is brought from the stable and harnessed slowly, the leather straps threaded through rings and buckled with practiced fingers, the animal patient and warm-smelling, its breath making small clouds in the morning air. The woman and her daughter have their own smaller bags, which they carry themselves, one bag each, worn on the back or carried in the hand depending on the terrain. They travel lighter than the merchant because they have no goods to sell, only themselves and what they need for the journey, and they have learned over the years to carry only what is truly necessary. The apprentice loads his own bag onto the cart with the merchant's permission because the cart has a little space at the back, and carrying a bag for several days of walking is hard on the shoulders, and the merchant allows this small thing without making much of it. They say very little to each other as they prepare. The innkeeper's wife stands in the doorway and watches them go, as she has watched other travelers go on other mornings, and she will watch others tomorrow and the day after, the comings and goings of the road, a kind of weather in her life, always changing and always the same. The road receives them. It is a dirt road, wide enough for two carts to pass each other with care, packed hard by generations of feet and wheels and hooves, flanked on either side by hedgerows and the occasional tree, its surface soft in the center where fewer feet have packed it, and harder near the edges where the ground slopes toward drainage ditches. The morning air is cool and still has a faint dampness in it from the previous night, and the grass along the edges of the road is silvered with dew. They begin to walk. Not much changes for the first hour. The road unrolls ahead of them in a gentle curve, rising slightly toward a distant ridge, and the countryside on either side is quiet. Fields of some grain crop half grown, a copse of trees at a distance, a farmhouse set back from the road with its shutters still closed. The birds have been awake for some time already, and their sounds fill the air without being particularly loud, a kind of background of chirping and occasional calls that is simply there, as much a part of the road as the dust. The first food of the road is eaten perhaps 2 hours after they set out. It does not come from the inn, or not all of it. Each traveler in this time would carry their own provisions for the road, things packed carefully before they left their home or bought in the last town, because the distance between inns or towns or markets could be several hours, and the body needs something to hold on to across those hours. The merchant's apprentice, whose name we might imagine as something simple, Thomas perhaps, or Piero if we are in a southern part of this world, reaches into the bag at the back of the cart and brings out a piece of cloth tied with a simple knot. Inside is a portion of what was prepared or bought the day before, a wedge of hard cheese, something like a firm, aged variety, pale yellow, with a rind that is slightly darker and a little rough to the touch. There is also a piece of dried sausage, which is dark and firm and carries a smell of salt and pepper and something smoky from the process of its making. And there is flatbread, not the risen bread of the inn, but a harder, thinner kind, more like a cracker, that was baked to be carried because it would not go soft quickly or grow mold as fast as leavened bread. He eats while walking, which was entirely normal, breaking off small pieces of the cheese with his fingers and eating them with pieces of the flatbread, not quickly, just steadily, the way a person eats when they are not sitting down to a meal, but simply keeping the body fueled for movement. The merchant does not eat yet. He is older, and his body is accustomed to the rhythms of the road, and he knows that the first food of the day, the porridge and bread at the inn, will carry him further than the young man's body will allow. He drives the cart from the small wooden seat at the front, the reins loose in his hands, the mule finding its own steady pace on the familiar road. The woman brings out something wrapped in a large leaf, a practice common in warmer climates, but also used in cooler ones when leaves were available, and unwraps a small portion of something that looks dark and dense. It is a kind of preserved fruit cake, or something close to it, made with dried plums or figs pressed together with a little honey and some grain flour, formed into a firm block that was then dried or lightly baked until it held its shape. This kind of food was made specifically for travel. It was compact, meaning it took up little space in a bag. It was calorie dense, meaning a small amount carried the body a long way. And it did not spoil quickly, which was perhaps the most important quality of all in a world without refrigeration, where the management of food and its freshness was a continuous and careful practice. She breaks a piece for her daughter. They eat it slowly, walking, and it is sweet in a mild, dried fruit kind of way, with a slight grain taste beneath the sweetness, and a faint floral note from the honey that was used in its making. It is not fresh exactly, and it is not something you would eat for pleasure at home, but on the road, after 2 hours of walking, with the cold of the morning still in your feet, it tastes like something entirely welcome. The road curves around the base of a hill, and for a few minutes they are in the shadow of it, and the air is noticeably cooler, and then the road comes out the other side, and the sun is fully up now, and the warmth of it settles on their cloaks and their faces, and they walk in this warmth without commenting on it, because it simply is, and there is something about warmth after coolness that the body receives without needing to speak about it. Slowly, the morning passes. There is a particular quality to a long day of walking or riding that is difficult to describe, but easy to recognize once you have felt it. It is a kind of hollow tiredness that sits not in any one place in the body, but everywhere at once, in the legs, and the back, and the shoulders, and the jaw. A settled weight that is not unpleasant exactly, but that makes you very aware of your body in a way that you are not when you are sitting still. And alongside this is a steady, low-level hunger that is not the sharp hunger of having missed a meal, but something more like the slow emptying of a vessel, the body using what it has been given and quietly asking for more. The travelers know this feeling well. They have been on the road for days. They have developed small rituals around it, ways of managing the hunger and the tiredness, so that they do not accumulate into something harder to deal with. The cheese is eaten in small pieces over the course of the morning, not all at once. The flatbread is broken slowly and chewed thoroughly. Water is sipped from a leather flask when the throat grows dry, though sparingly, because the next reliable source of water might be a well in a village an hour away, or a stream they will cross, or the inn at the end of the day. The sound of the cart wheels on the road is a constant, low sound, wood and iron on packed dirt, a rhythm that is not musical exactly, but that has a regularity to it that is calming in its own way. The mule's hooves mark each step with a soft, solid impact. The birds in the hedgerows change as the road moves through different kinds of land. One kind of bird in the open fields, another in the patches of forest, another near the occasional stream, and though none of the travelers would necessarily notice this consciously, their ears hear the changes and file them away somewhere behind conscious thought. Not much changes in the middle of the morning. The road continues. The landscape continues. The feet continue. And then, sometime around midday, the quality of the light changes and the shadows shift, and the stomach makes its presence known more firmly, and without anyone suggesting it explicitly, the small group begins to look for a place to stop. Stopping for the midday meal was not always a planned affair, but it had its preferred circumstances. A tree was ideal, or a group of trees, because trees meant shade, and by midday the sun could be warm enough that shade was welcome, and also because there was something fundamentally comfortable about the back of a tree, the way you could sit with your back against the bark and feel the solidity of it. A stream was even better if it could be found, because the sound of water was pleasant, and because the horses or mules could drink, and because water could be taken for cooking, if cooking was possible, though at midday on the road it usually was not. Today, they find a place where a large oak tree stands beside a low stone wall at the edge of a field, close enough to the road to be convenient, far enough from it that they are not in the way of whatever other travelers might pass. The wall creates a kind of seat low and flat, and the grass beneath the tree is dry and not too long, and someone's horse or donkey has cropped it close enough in some recent past that it makes a reasonable surface to sit on. They stop here. The mule is freed from the traces enough to let it lower its head and graze. The travelers find their places, some on the wall, some on the ground with their backs against the tree, and there is a brief, comfortable silence as packs are set down and bodies rest. The midday meal is the main meal of the traveling day, and it is assembled from what each person is carrying. The merchant brings out a cloth bundle that is larger than the apprentice's morning snack. Inside, it is a portion of roasted meat, probably pork, because pigs were common and inexpensive in this period and could be salted and roasted and carried for a day or two before it needed to be eaten. The meat is cold now, of course, the fat slightly congealed and white around the edges, but it is still recognizable as something that was warm and savory when it was cooked and eaten at room temperature. It has a dense, solid flavor that is satisfying in a way that cold food can be when you are genuinely hungry. There is also a hard-boiled egg, which the merchant peels with slow, deliberate fingers, dropping the shell pieces into the grass beside him. The egg is cool and firm, the yolk a deep yellow-orange color that speaks to chickens who ate well, the white smooth and slightly rubbery in the way of boiled eggs, and he eats it in 3 slow bites with a pinch of salt that he carries in a small folded square of cloth, tapping a little of the salt onto each bite before putting it in his mouth. The woman and her daughter have their own provisions, slightly different from the merchant's, reflecting where they came from and what was available to them or what they preferred. They have a pot of something preserved, not a clay pot, but a small wooden container sealed with a wooden lid and a wrapping of wax around the rim to keep it tight, and inside it is a mixture of vegetables, cabbage perhaps, and turnip that have been pickled in salt and a little vinegar. This pickled vegetable mixture would have been a common traveling food in this region and period, because pickling was one of the primary ways of preserving food for journeys, and the sour, salty flavors were considered to aid digestion and to cut through the heaviness of the bread and salted meat that formed the bulk of travel food. They eat from this small pot with their fingers or with a small wooden spoon that the older woman carries tucked into her traveling belt, each taking a small portion, the younger daughter eating more quickly than her mother, the crunch of the pickled cabbage, a brief quiet sound beneath the larger sounds of the afternoon, the wind in the oak leaves above them, the distant sound of the mule tearing at the grass. The apprentice Thomas, or Piero, eats the rest of his dried sausage and finishes his flatbread, and then looks at what the merchant has brought out, and the merchant silently breaks off a piece of the cold roast pork and passes it without making a particular gesture of generosity. It is simply the natural thing to do, and the young man receives it with a small nod and eats it slowly. There is bread here too, though by midday the bread each person carries has been in their bag for many hours and has grown quite firm. But bread that is firm is still bread, and bread is the foundation of the traveling diet in this time and place, the one thing that is always present, always useful, always eaten. a piece of firm bread held in the hand and bitten into slowly is not unpleasant. The crust has a certain resistance to it that is almost satisfying, and the inside, which is denser and less dry than the crust, still carries something of the original taste of grain and yeast and the heat of the oven, even after many hours in a bag. Gently, the meal settles into a comfortable quiet. After eating, no one rushes to move. This is important to understand about long journeys in this period. Resting was not laziness, it was practical. The body needed time to process food, to allow blood to go to the stomach and begin the work of digestion, and a traveler who stopped, sat still, and rested for half an hour after the midday meal would travel better in the afternoon than one who immediately stood up and continued walking. This was not something they read in a book. It was something they knew from experience, from years of travel, from the feel of their own bodies. So they sit. The merchant closes his eyes, not to sleep exactly, but to rest them, to remove them for a few minutes from the work of watching the road and the cart and the world around them. The woman leans her back against the stone wall and lets her eyes drift over the field in front of her, a field of young grain, pale green in the midday light, moving very slightly in the wind, and she watches it without thinking anything in particular about it. The apprentice lies down in the grass beneath the tree, flat on his back, his head on his traveling bag, and he looks up through the oak leaves at the sky, which is pale blue and very still, and he may or may not drift briefly into sleep. It is hard to tell from the outside, his breathing slow and his face relaxed, and his hands open at his sides. Not much changes for this half hour, or perhaps longer. The mule grazes. The birds continue their afternoon sounds. The occasional cloud passes over the sun, and the light shifts for a moment and then returns. The road in the distance is empty, or nearly so, a figure walking alone in the far distance that grows slowly closer and then passes without stopping. A pilgrim, perhaps, by the look of the staff and the rough cloak, moving with a particular kind of purposeful steadiness that suggests someone who has been walking for a very long time. The afternoon is the longest part of the journey day. The morning has the novelty of beginning, the fresh start, the porridge and bread still warm in the stomach, the legs not yet tired. The evening has the promise of stopping, of the inn, of warmth and a hot meal and a place to set down the bag. But the afternoon is just the road, stretching ahead in the same way it has been stretching since morning, with no particular end visible and no particular beginning behind you anymore. Travelers in this time developed many small strategies for the afternoon. Some talked more as the day went on. The initial reserve that kept strangers quiet in the morning loosened as the hours passed, and by mid-afternoon it was not uncommon to find a traveling group in quiet conversation, not about anything very important, not about the news of towns or the price of linen or the condition of the road ahead, though these things were spoken about too, but about smaller things, the name of a plant growing in the ditch, the sound a bird was making, whether the road was better or worse than the last time each of them had traveled this way. Some told stories, or rather told memories, which is a different kind of story, the kind without a fixed plot, where one memory leads to another and time passes without you particularly noticing it passing. An older traveler might speak of a journey made 20 years ago, a particularly hard winter crossing, a bridge that was washed out, a town where the bread was very good, and the memory would arrive in their voice like something that still had some warmth in it, and the listeners would walk in its warmth for a few minutes. And some ate, not much, and not quickly, but as the afternoon stretched on and the energy from the midday meal began to thin, the hand would drift toward the pack or the pocket and bring out something small, something to keep the body from that hollow tiredness growing too large. A piece of dried fruit was common. Dried plums, which we might call prunes, were among the most frequently carried travel foods of this period because they were small and light and kept for a long time without any particular care, and because their sweetness and density provided real energy in a compact form, and because they had the additional benefit of keeping the digestion working during days of walking and eating solid, heavy food. They were not considered a delicacy. They were simply useful, practical, the small dark fruits taken from a pouch and chewed slowly and swallowed without ceremony. Dried figs served a similar purpose in warmer regions, or where trade routes brought them in. A dried fig is quite different from a fresh one, firmer and chewier, with a concentrated sweetness that is more like honey than fruit, and a slight graininess from the seeds inside that stays on the tongue for a moment after swallowing. They were packed densely in baskets or wrapped in leaves and could survive weeks of travel without becoming inedible. Sometimes, if the road passed through an orchard or near one, someone might simply reach out and take a piece of fruit from a tree, a wild apple in autumn, small and tart and not particularly sweet but full of juice, or a handful of berries from a hedge. This was a common enough practice that it was understood rather than condemned. A traveler taking one apple from a tree that held hundreds was not considered theft in the way that taking a farmer's grain would be. There was an informal economy of small things along the road that operated on a kind of unstated generosity. The apprentice finds a handful of small, very dark berries growing in a hedge the road passes through, and he picks them without stopping his walking, eating them from his palm, staining his fingers briefly blue-black, their tartness sharp and vivid on his tongue, after hours of bread and dried meat. He offers some to the woman beside him, and she accepts a few, and they eat them without speaking, the tartness a kind of small refreshment in the sameness of the afternoon. Slowly, the sun begins its long afternoon descent. In the late afternoon, the light changes in a way that travelers always notice, even if they cannot always say why. It becomes horizontal rather than vertical, coming at an angle rather than from above, and this changes the way the road looks and the way the landscape looks, casting long shadows from every tree and post and stone, making the familiar unfamiliar, or rather, making the afternoon feel different from the morning, even if the same road and the same fields surround you. The colors deepen slightly. The greens of the hedgerows become richer. The pale dirt of the road takes on a warmer tone. The hunger that has been building through the afternoon becomes more insistent now, not uncomfortable exactly, but definite, a clear message from the body that the dried fruit and the berries and the last piece of flatbread eaten an hour ago are no longer enough, and that something real is needed, and the inn is perhaps an hour away. There is a kind of energizing effect that the thought of the inn produces in tired travelers, something similar to what the sight of home produces after a long day's work. Not a dramatic boost, but a quiet deepening of resolve. The knowledge that the end is in sight, making the last stretch manageable in a way it might not be if the end were uncertain. They walk this last hour in a different quality of tiredness, the tiredness of almost done rather than the tiredness of still going, which sounds like the same thing but feels entirely different. The legs know when they are nearly finished, and they find the last resources to carry the body to the stopping place. The inn announces itself from some distance away, first as a smell or a combination of smells, wood smoke definitely, and something being cooked, roasting or boiling, and the particular animal smell of a stable that is occupied, and these smells carried on the late afternoon air are deeply familiar and deeply welcome to anyone who has been on the road since morning. Then as a sound, the sound of voices, not many, but a few, from somewhere inside, and the low sound of the fire and the creak of a door. Then as a shape, low and solid and lit from within, the oiled cloth in the windows glowing orange and yellow from the fire, and candles inside, the door standing open to let in the last of the day's warmth, a dog lying across the threshold who lifts its head and looks at them without particular concern, and then puts its head back down. They arrive. The evening meal at the inn is, for most travelers in this period, the best meal of the day, and it deserves to be described slowly. It is prepared by whoever runs the kitchen, usually the innkeeper's wife or a woman she employs for this purpose, and it begins hours before the travelers arrive. The fire in the main kitchen is built up in the afternoon, large enough to accommodate several pots and perhaps a spit over it, and the cooking is long and slow because the food that is most available and most affordable for an inn that must feed travelers cheaply is the kind of food that improves with long cooking. Bones and cheap cuts of meat simmered for hours in water with whatever vegetables are available, turning into something rich and thick by the time it reaches the table. The soup or stew that is the center of the evening meal in inns like this one is not the same 2 days running. It is made from what there is, and what there is changes with the season and the region and what was bought or traded for in the nearby market. But certain things appear in it reliably. Onions, because onions were grown almost everywhere and kept well and added flavor to everything. Turnips or parsnips, the root vegetables that formed a large part of the common diet in this period. Whatever meat was cheapest, often pork, sometimes the less desirable parts of a chicken or a rabbit, sometimes simply the bones with a little meat clinging to them, simmered until the bones gave up their marrow and their collagen, and the liquid around them became thick and golden and deeply savory. This is what is set on the table tonight. The pot is brought from the kitchen by the serving girl, a girl of perhaps 14, who moves carefully with the heavy clay vessel, setting it in the center of the long wooden table where the travelers have seated themselves on rough benches. She brings bread next, a new loaf, baked today, still slightly warm, round and dense with a thick, dark crust. And she brings a jug of ale, which is the standard drink of the common inn in this region and period. A mild ale, low in alcohol but full of flavor, slightly bitter from the hops or the other herbs used to flavor it, slightly cloudy, and served at the temperature of the room, which is warm from the fire. The stew is ladled into wooden bowls, and the bread is set in the center of the table for everyone to take from, and the ale is poured into earthenware cups, and the travelers eat. There is very little conversation during the eating. This is not unfriendliness. It is simply that after a day on the road, the body wants to eat before it wants to talk, and the food in front of them is good or good enough, and it is hot, which is perhaps the most important thing. And eating hot food after a day of cold travel has a particular quality of restoration that is very hard to describe, but very easy to feel. The stew has a richness to it that comes entirely from the long cooking, the onions having dissolved almost completely into the liquid, the turnip pieces soft and slightly sweet, the bits of pork floating here and there, the whole thing carrying a deep, savory smell of meat and fire and long simmering that fills the nose and the mouth simultaneously. The bread is torn into pieces and used to soak up the liquid, because in a world where every calorie matters and where waste is not a concept that makes any sense, you do not leave good soup behind in the bowl. You soak it with the bread until the bowl is clean. The ale is drunk slowly. It is not something you drink quickly here, not something to rush through. It is a drink that accompanies the food, and then the rest of the evening, sitting in the cup between sips, warming slightly as the meal goes on, changing subtly as the hour gets later, and the fire burns lower, and the room fills with more warmth and smoke, and the smell of many people sitting close together after a long day outdoors. Not much changes during the meal, except the level of the ale in the jug and the emptying of the bowls. Then there is a second serving, because travelers who have walked all day need more than one bowl of stew to fill them, and the serving girl brings the pot around again, and bowls are held out, and more stew is ladled in, and more bread is torn from the loaf, and the eating continues, slower now, the sharpest edge of hunger already gone. What remains a gentler kind of hunger that is really more like appetite, the pleasure of eating when you are already mostly full, the last piece of bread soaked in the last of the stew just because it tastes good. After eating, there is a period of sitting. It is too early to sleep, or the body needs time to settle before sleep is possible, and so the travelers sit at the table with their cups of ale, and the conversation that was absent during the meal now appears slowly in small pieces, the way a fire builds from a spark rather than appearing all at once. The merchant speaks a little about the road ahead, what he knows of it, where the next inn is, whether there is a market day in the town 3 days hence that might affect the price of what he is carrying. The woman asks about a particular road junction that she has been uncertain about, and the merchant knows it, and describes the turn without particular detail, simply the shape of the landmark you look for, a large split oak, a certain kind of stone wall, and she nods and commits it to memory. The apprentice listens without speaking much. He is at that age where listening is more valuable than speaking, and he knows it at some level, not from being told, but from the accumulated experience of these journeys. The way information travels in small pieces on the road and must be gathered carefully. The fire burns lower. More wood is added by the innkeeper, who moves through the room without much interaction, tending the fire, clearing the table, extinguishing the candles in the corners where no one is sitting anymore. The oiled cloth windows are dark now, the world outside having gone fully into the night, and the only light is the fire and the two remaining candles, and the shadows in the room are deep and soft, and the warmth is still there but more intimate now, less the warmth of the afternoon's fire and more the warmth of bodies and low burning wood, a residual warmth that is deeply comfortable. One by one, the travelers excuse themselves to the sleeping room, and in the morning it begins again. Not this morning, not yet. Let us hold the night for a while longer, because the journey is not only the moving parts of it. The nights between the days of travel are part of the journey too, and they have their own relationship with food and rest, and the body's deep need to restore itself. When a traveler lies down in this period, the body is genuinely tired in a way that a modern body rarely is. It has moved for 8 or 10 hours, carrying itself and its bag through whatever the road offered, cold and warmth and uphill and downhill and wet ground and dry, and it has eaten not quite enough or just enough, and drunk not quite enough or just enough, and it needs sleep the way a lamp needs oil, completely and without reservation. But before sleep, there was sometimes a small thing, not always, not a ritual exactly, but a practice that appeared often enough to be worth mentioning. In some inns, the serving girl or the innkeeper's wife would offer a last small thing before the candles were put out, something to settle the stomach, something to close the day. It might be a cup of warmed ale, thickened with a little bread and sweetened with honey, something called a caudle in some places, a warm drink that was thick and sweet and mildly alcoholic, and that was considered genuinely medicinal in its ability to help a person sleep deeply. Or it might simply be a piece of bread and a little honey, eaten slowly in the quiet of the sleeping room, the sweetness of the honey a last small pleasure before the darkness. Or it might be nothing at all. Sometimes the exhaustion of the road was enough, and a traveler simply lay down in their cloak and closed their eyes, and the world went away, slowly, very slowly, like a river finding its level. Let us now step, very gently, into a different kind of journey. We have been on the road in a temperate northern part of the world, among people who deal in cloth and move on dirt roads between market towns. But the story of eating during a long journey is not only that story. It is many stories, and they are all quiet, and they all have the same underlying shape, the body moving through the world, and the food that keeps it moving, and the particular relationship between the two that long travel creates. In a different place and a different century, though not so very different in its essential character, there is a river. The river is wide and slow and brown, with the silt of many upstream places, and on it there is a boat, a flat-bottomed wooden boat, perhaps 12 paces long and 4 wide, loaded with goods and carrying several people who are making the journey downriver from one market to another, a journey of several days, the river carrying them more gently than a road could. River travel is different from road travel in ways that affect everything, including food. On a road, you stop to eat. You find a tree or a wall and you sit down and you eat what you have brought with you, and then you get up and continue. But on a river, particularly on a slow river with a cooperative current, there is no need to stop. The boat continues. The river carries it. And so eating happens on the boat while moving, which is not very different from walking and eating, except that you are sitting down, and the movement is the movement of water rather than of your own legs, and the sounds around you are water sounds rather than road sounds. The boat has a small hearth on it, a metal box, or a clay firebox set on a bed of sand or stone to protect the wooden deck from the heat, and in this small hearth, a low fire can be maintained even while moving, enough fire to heat water, enough to keep a pot warm, enough for the simple cooking that is possible on a boat that is also a traveling home for several days. The cook on this boat, if we can call them that, is one of the boatmen's wives, a woman who came along for this particular journey because her husband asked her to, and because she preferred the river to sitting at home, and because she knows how to manage food in a small space with limited resources, which is a skill that not everyone has, and that river travel requires absolutely. She works in the small central portion of the boat where the firebox is, moving carefully in the gentle rocking of the water, handling the pot and the small clay jug of water and the bag of provisions with the economy of motion that comes from years of doing this kind of work in a small space. The morning meal on the boat begins before the boat even leaves its mooring. A porridge is made here too, because porridge was the universal morning food of common people across much of the world in this period, the simplest and most efficient way to turn grain and water and fire into something that would carry a body through the morning. The grain here might be different, millet perhaps, rather than oats, depending on what river and what region we are imagining, but the principle is the same. Grain soaked in water overnight, heated in the morning over a fire until thick, eaten with whatever was available to add flavor and substance. The boatmen eat it from wooden bowls, seated at the front of the boat, and one of them holds the rudder loosely as the boat drifts on the gentle morning current, because the river here is calm and the direction is known, and you can eat and steer at the same time if you are familiar with the water. The provisions on the boat are stored under the boards at the stern, in a dark, cool space that serves as the boat's larder. There is salted fish wrapped in cloth, which is a reliable and common traveling food on rivers in this period, because fish were plentiful in most rivers and could be salted cheaply and carried for many days without spoiling. There are dried legumes, lentils, or dried peas, or dried beans, which require soaking and cooking, but which are one of the most nutritious things you can carry in a bag, because they are full of protein and last for months. There is the inevitable bread, bought before departing, growing firmer each day but still edible. There is a small quantity of onions, because onions traveled well and flavored everything else. And there is oil, a small clay jug sealed with a cork, because in this region, oil was used for cooking, where in the northern country of our first travelers, fat or lard would have been used instead. On the second day of the river journey, the cook prepares the lentils. This is not a quick process. Dried lentils that have been soaking overnight must be cooked for a long time over a low fire, the kind of long, slow cooking that the river journey actually accommodates quite well, since there is time and the fire can be kept going, and there is nothing else to do but to watch the banks pass and to tend the pot occasionally. She begins in the morning, draining the water from the soaked lentils and adding fresh water to the pot, then setting the pot on the firebox over a very low fire. She adds onion cut into rough pieces and a little oil and whatever dried herbs she has brought, perhaps something like dried coriander seeds or cumin, ground between two stones into a rough powder, because spices were expensive and only carried in small amounts. But even a small amount of ground spice added to a pot of plain lentils produces something entirely different from a pot of plain lentils without it. The pot simmers for most of the morning. The smell of the lentils and the onion and the spice drifts across the boat and out over the water, and it changes the quality of the morning, adding a domestic warmth to what might otherwise be simply the smell of the river, mud and water and green things, and the occasional smell of fish. By midday, the lentils are soft, the liquid around them dark and thick, the onion dissolved into the whole, and the smell of the spice has deepened into the mixture and become part of it, rather than something sitting on top. The cook adds salt carefully, tasting as she goes, because salt was valuable and not to be wasted, and she adjusts the fire to keep the pot warm rather than continuing to cook it. The midday meal on the boat is eaten while the boat continues to move. There is a kind of pleasure in this, eating on a moving boat, watching the banks of the river pass with their willows and reeds, an occasional glimpse of a far-off farmhouse, the water brown and slow and carrying the reflection of the sky in its surface. The lentil stew is eaten from bowls with bread, and the bread is used here too to scoop rather than to soak, because the stew is thick enough to be scooped, and this is a satisfying way to eat, the bread and the stew arriving in the mouth together, the soft, earthy, slightly spiced lentil mixing with the firm resistance of old bread. One of the boatmen catches a fish during the afternoon, which is a simple matter on a slow river, a line in the water and patience, and the fish is cleaned and cooked toward evening. The cook slicing it and laying the pieces in the pan with a little oil and cooking them quickly over a higher fire than she has used all day. The smell of the cooking fish, sharp and savory in the cooling evening air. The river at evening is a particularly quiet place. The birds that have been calling all day have settled. The sound of the water against the hull is softer, more regular. The banks are darker, the trees losing their color as the light falls, becoming shapes rather than things with leaves and texture. The boat is moored for the night against a shelving bank, where the water is shallow and the ground holds the mooring stakes securely. They eat the fish with the last of the lentils, warmed again over the fire, and more bread, and they drink water from the jug, because river water must be treated with some care before drinking, and the jug was filled from a spring earlier in the day. And then the fire is banked, and the boat is quiet, and the river carries its sound against the hull all night, a constant, soft sound that is perhaps the most soothing sound in the world to people who have lived and traveled on water. Not much changes through the night. The river flows. In a different part of the world, and a different time, still many centuries ago, a long journey takes a very different shape. Here the land is dry. The air is dry. The light is different, harder, and more direct. And the shadows are sharp-edged, where in the northern country they were soft. This is a desert or semi-desert landscape, the kind where you can see very far in every direction, and where the road is not a road exactly, but a route, a path worn into the ground by generations of feet and hooves, crossing a landscape that has no fences or hedgerows, but has instead the occasional dry riverbed and the occasional cluster of date palms around a well. The people here are merchants too, but they travel in a group called a caravan, because in the desert, traveling alone is dangerous, and traveling in a group is safer, and the group has its own organization, its own social structure, its own way of managing food and water and rest that has been developed over many generations of desert travel. The caravan has perhaps 20 or 30 people, plus the animals, camels mostly, loaded with goods wrapped in cloth and leather and rope. And these animals carry not only the goods, but also the water, in large skins suspended from their sides, water that must last until the next well, the distance to which is known precisely and calculated carefully before setting out. Food here is the subject of the most careful planning. Everything that will be eaten on the journey must be carried, because in the desert there is nothing to find, or very little, and what you have when you leave is what you will have, minus whatever you consume each day, and the calculation of this, how much to carry, how much to eat each day, how many days to the next resupply, is a kind of mathematics that experienced desert travelers do naturally, as easily as breathing. The staple food of the desert caravan is dates, and this is not a coincidence. Dates are perhaps the most perfect travel food ever developed by any human culture, and they are perfectly matched to the desert environment in which they grow. They are extremely calorie dense, meaning a small weight of dates provides a large amount of energy. They contain sugar that the body absorbs quickly, providing almost immediate energy when you eat them, and then a slower, more sustained release as the body processes the fiber and other components. They keep for an extraordinary length of time, months in the heat of the desert, without spoiling, because their high sugar content is itself a preservative. They weigh relatively little for the energy they contain. They are small and easy to eat on the move, without utensils, without preparation, simply picked from the bag and eaten one at a time. And they taste good, sweet, and rich with a deep, caramel-like flavor that is satisfying in a way that purely functional food is not. Every person in the caravan carries their personal supply of dates, and the group as a whole carries a communal supply, and these two things together form the backbone of eating during the journey. The morning in the desert begins very early, before the sun is up, because the cooler hours of the night and early morning are when travel is possible, when the heat has not yet built to the level that exhausts both animals and people, and the caravan will have been moving since well before dawn, the camels loaded in the darkness, the people finding their places among them by the light of the stars. The morning meal is dates and nothing else, eaten while walking, a small handful taken from the bag at the waist, chewed slowly in the cool and still dark air, the sweetness of them sharp and clean in a way that food eaten while moving sometimes is, the body grateful for the energy without asking for anything more. The water is rationed carefully, a specific amount per person per animal, measured and kept to, because the mathematics of water in the desert is not like the mathematics of any other kind of travel. Water is not something you find along the way, or not reliably. Water is something you carry, and what you carry is all you have. By mid-morning, the sun has found the earth, and the temperature has risen, and the caravan has found its resting place, usually a low spot where a large rock or a dry embankment creates some small shade, and here they rest through the hottest hours, the camels kneeling, the people settling into the shade, some sleeping, some simply resting with their eyes closed against the brightness. This is when the main meal of the day is eaten, not at midday exactly, because the desert teaches you to eat before the heat is at its peak, to fuel the body before the long rest, and then to rest through the hours when the heat would burn through any effort. The midday meal in the desert caravan is more elaborate than the morning dates. Someone in the group, perhaps several people working together, will have brought a small iron pot, lightweight and blackened from years of use, and in this pot they will prepare a dish from the communal provisions. There might be dried meat, dried in the desert air until it is so dry it snaps rather than tears, and this dried meat can be ground between stones into a rough powder that dissolves quickly when added to boiling water, thickening it and adding flavor and protein. There might be dried legumes here too, though the desert varieties are different from those of the river, smaller and harder, and they must be cooked long. But in the desert, fire is expensive. Wood is scarce. The fire here is not a generous inn, fire burning logs all day. It is a small, careful fire, built with whatever dry material can be found, twigs and dry camel dung, and occasionally a piece of carried charcoal, used efficiently, no more than what is needed to heat the pot, extinguished as soon as the food is cooked. The fire is started with the practiced speed of experience, the tinder lit, the small sticks added carefully, the larger fuel placed once the fire is established, the pot hung from a small iron frame or balanced on 3 stones above the flame. The water boils, the dried meat powder goes in, perhaps a handful of legumes that were set to soak in a small amount of water the night before, the soaking water saved and added to the pot because nothing is wasted. Perhaps dried onion or garlic that has dried in the desert air to a papery lightness. A pinch of salt. The result is a thin soup or a thick broth, not much to look at, but hot and savory and deeply welcome after the morning's walking, ladled into the small metal cups or clay bowls that each person carries, eaten quickly before the heat of it fades, and because the resting period is not long and there is more to eat. Alongside the soup, more dates, and perhaps some flatbread, if there is any left from the last village, though by now it is very hard indeed and must be soaked briefly in the soup before it can be chewed comfortably. This combination, the soup and the hard bread and the dates, is not a luxurious meal by any standard, but it is enough, and its adequacy is not just physical but psychological. Eating together, even in the shade of a rock in the middle of a desert, creates a brief moment of community, of shared warmth, of being in a group rather than simply moving through a landscape alone. The rest period in the desert has a particular quality of stillness that is unlike any other stillness. In the northern country, silence had texture in it, birds and wind and the settling of wood and stone. On the river, silence was underlaid by water. But in the desert, the silence of the resting hour is vast and slightly pressing. The sun so large in the sky that it seems to take up all the available space, the heat creating a slight shimmer in the distance that makes far things look uncertain, and the only sounds are the occasional sound of a camel shifting its position, or the soft sound of sand moving in a very low wind, or a human voice speaking quietly from somewhere in the resting group. Some people sleep. Some people talk softly, the conversation slow and meandering in the heat, not about anything in particular. Some people work, mending straps or checking goods or doing the small maintenance tasks that a long journey always generates: the torn seam, the worn edge of a sandal, the rope that has frayed slightly and needs to be spliced before it breaks entirely. And then, as the sun begins to fall from its highest point and the temperature begins its long, slow descent, the caravan stirs again. The camels are loaded, the water skins are accounted for, the bags are adjusted, and they move. The afternoon in the desert is the most pleasant traveling time, especially in the later portion of it, when the light is angled and golden and the air has some movement in it again. The landscape, which in the midday heat had seemed almost hostile, is softer now, more interesting. The shadows of the dunes or the rocks or the low scrubby plants drawing lines across the ground that give the land a depth it lacked at noon. Traveling in a caravan is in some ways a constant education in patience. You move at the pace of the slowest animal, which is the pace of the loaded camel, which is steady and unhurried, and covers the ground at exactly the speed it has always covered the ground, neither faster nor slower, regardless of what you might prefer. The camels are not indifferent to their work. They are simply entirely committed to doing it at their own pace, and the experienced caravan traveler has long since made peace with this, has learned to inhabit the pace of the camel rather than fighting it, to let the landscape pass at the speed it will pass rather than wishing it would pass faster. In the late afternoon, as the sun nears the horizon and the sky begins to change color, more dates are eaten. A small thing, a few dates, passed from hand to hand among the group, walking near each other, not a meal but a maintenance, the body asking for a small top-up of energy for the last stretch before the evening stop. The evening stop in the desert is chosen carefully. It must have certain qualities, or as many of them as are available: some shelter from the wind, which in the desert at night can be cold in a way that contradicts the daytime heat, level ground for sleeping, and proximity to the route for the next morning. Often these things do not all coincide perfectly, and compromises are made, a less sheltered spot because the level ground is here, or a slightly longer morning's walk because the good stopping place is a little off the direct route. Fires are built at the stopping place, larger fires than at the midday rest, because the night is long and the desert is cold at night, and fire provides warmth and light and a gathering point and a degree of safety all at once. The evening meal in the desert caravan is the most elaborate meal of the traveling day, not because it has many ingredients, but because it has time, and because the evening fire is large enough to cook things properly. Rice, if it can be carried, which it can in the quantities needed for a small group of people over a short journey, is prepared in a large pot over the fire, the grains washed with a small amount of precious water, and then cooked in water until soft, the flame adjusted by moving the pot closer to or further from the center of the fire, which is the desert cook's primary tool for managing heat. The rice is stirred occasionally with a long wooden stick, and it fills the night air with its particular warm, starchy smell, clean and comforting. Into the rice, or alongside it, goes dried meat again, or dried fish if the group came from a coastal place, or simply more legumes, the protein component of a meal that has no fresh meat and no fresh vegetables. And dates, always dates, both cooked into the main dish in some preparations to add sweetness and eaten fresh from the bag alongside the meal for the same reason. There is something about eating around a fire at night in the desert that has a quality quite different from eating in any other situation. The darkness here is complete in a way that it is not in a landscape with trees and buildings. It begins a short distance beyond the fire's light, and it is absolute, and the sky above it, freed from any competing light, is filled with stars in their true quantity and brightness, which is a quantity and brightness that most people in a modern time have never seen. The stars in a desert sky are not scattered or occasional. They are packed, dense, layered, the Milky Way a visible band of crowded light crossing from horizon to horizon, and to sit beneath this sky and eat from a bowl of rice by firelight is to be aware of your own smallness in a way that is not frightening, but simply true, a fact of the universe quietly confirming itself. The conversations around the desert fire at night, when there are conversations, tend to be quiet and long, the kind of conversations that start anywhere and arrive somewhere unexpected, the kind where the silence between one person finishing speaking and another beginning to speak is not an absence, but a presence, a comfortable space that everyone inhabits together. Not much changes through the night. The fire burns lower, more wood is added, or it is not. People sleep in their blankets, heads toward the fire for warmth, feet pointing outward in the classic sleeping arrangement of the desert caravan. The stars move in their slow arc across the sky. The camels breathe their long, slow, even breaths. And in the darkness, in the quiet, the food eaten at the fire sits warmly in the body and does its work. Let us drift now, even more slowly, into another kind of journey, This one is by sea, a wooden ship, not large, moving across water that is sometimes calm and sometimes not, carrying a small crew and a few passengers, including some who are not accustomed to sea travel and who are finding it both fascinating and uncomfortable in equal measure. The sea is a different kind of journey from all the others because the sea has its own pace and its own decision about how fast you will travel, and you cannot walk faster or rest when you like. You are in the sea's hands, or rather in the wind's hands, and the wind does as it will. Food on a ship is perhaps the most constrained version of traveling food because the ship carries everything it will eat for the entire journey. There is no stopping at an inn, no hedgerow with berries, no orchard to pass through. There is only what was loaded before departure, and it must last. And this requires a degree of planning and discipline that makes all other forms of travel food management seem simple. The ship's provisions are divided into the communal stores, managed by the ship's cook, who is responsible for feeding the crew and sometimes the passengers, and the personal provisions that each passenger or higher ranking crew member carries for themselves to supplement the communal food or to have something familiar from home. The communal stores on a ship in this period consist of a small number of things, but they are chosen for their reliability and their staying power. There is ship's biscuit, which is not the soft, crumbly thing the word biscuit suggests in some modern languages, but a hard, dense cracker baked twice, the second baking driving out all remaining moisture, so that the result is something almost stone-like in its texture, which can survive weeks or months of sea air and humidity without becoming moldy. It was eaten by soaking in water or in soup until it softened, or simply gnawed at slowly, the jaw doing patient work over something that gave up its calories reluctantly. There is salt pork, the fat and lean parts of the pig preserved in barrels of brine, which will last for months if the brine is maintained and the barrel is kept cool. The salt pork is eaten after being soaked in fresh water to remove some of the excess salt, and then cooked, either boiled in water to make a thin broth, or simply eaten cold if fuel for the fire is limited. There is dried peas, an entire barrel of them, which will be made into pea soup again and again across the voyage, because pea soup from dried peas is filling and nutritious and easy to make in large quantities and relatively inoffensive in flavor, meaning that people who are already dealing with the discomfort of being on a moving ship for days will eat it without complaint, which is not something you can say about all foods. There is the fresh food, which is eaten first in the first days of the voyage. Vegetables that were bought in port, cabbages and onions and turnips, eaten raw or cooked, their freshness a luxury that fades quickly, their texture and flavor the thing that people on long voyages miss most acutely, not meat, surprisingly, but fresh vegetables, the crunch and water content and green taste of something that was growing a few days ago. And there is ale or wine or water, depending on the region and the time and the preference and the resources of the ship, kept in barrels, managed carefully, because dehydration on a sea voyage is a real concern, and the body's need for liquid is not flexible. The cook on this ship works in a small, dark, smoky area below the main deck, where a small hearth is built on a bed of sand in a metal-lined box, similar to the riverboat, but more confined, more subject to the ship's motion. When the sea is rough, no fire is lit and no cooking is done, because fire in a violently moving ship are an obvious and serious problem. On those days, people eat cold, ship's biscuit soaked in water, salt pork straight from the barrel, a little vinegar, dried fruit if there is any. When the sea is calm and a fire can be maintained, pea soup appears in the large wooden bowls, and the cook is regarded with something approaching gratitude. The smell of the ship is unlike any other smell in these traveling stories. It is salt, first and always, the salt of the sea itself, which permeates everything: the wood of the ship, the ropes, the canvas of the sails, the clothing and hair of everyone aboard. Beneath the salt is tar, which is used to waterproof the wood and the ropes, and has a dark, sharp, slightly bitter smell that once you have encountered it in sufficient quantity, you will never forget. And beneath both of those is the smell of the below decks area where the stores are kept and where the passengers sleep, a complicated smell of wood and damp and close quarters living and salt meat and biscuit, and the particular smell of a small number of people in a small space, which is not exactly unpleasant, but is very distinctly itself. The passengers find their own relationship with the smell and the food and the motion in the first few days. Some are immediately at home on the water, their bodies adjusting quickly, their appetites unchanged from land. Others take longer, their stomachs uncertain in the first days, eating little, spending time on deck in the fresh air rather than below where the smell is stronger and the motion is more felt. These people eat ship's biscuit slowly, one piece at a time, and drink small amounts of water, and wait for their bodies to decide that the sea was, in fact, acceptable. The passenger who interests us most on this particular ship is an older man, a scholar or a cleric, or someone who has spent most of his life in one place, and is now, for reasons that are his own and private, making a sea journey, perhaps the first he has ever made, to a destination that might take 3 weeks or more to reach. He has brought his own provisions, packed in a wooden chest that sits at the foot of his sleeping mat below decks. The chest contains things chosen with care, the same hard cheese that appears in all these stories, because hard cheese was the universal and reliable traveling food across all these worlds. Some dried figs, packed in a cloth bag, a small leather bottle of vinegar, which was used both as a condiment and as a preventive against illness, a few small loaves of spiced bread, denser than regular bread, and flavored with a little anise or fennel, baked hard specifically for travel, and a small quantity of something more precious, a few ounces of dried herbs mixed with spices, wrapped in waxed cloth, that he intended to use to flavor the ship's food if it needed it, which it would. In the first days, when the sea is new and his body is uncertain, he eats very little from either his own provisions or the ship's stores. He drinks water slowly from his small cup. He sits on deck when he can and watches the water and the horizon, which is the traditional cure for seasickness. because it gives the eyes something stable to focus on in a world that will not stop moving. On the third day, when his body has made its accommodation with the sea, his appetite returns, and with it a very specific and intense hunger of the kind that follows a period of not eating, where the body seems to be making up for lost time, and everything tastes more vivid and more welcome than it usually does. He eats a piece of his spiced bread, hard and dry as it is, and it tastes extraordinary to him in his hungry state, the anise coming through clearly, the sweetness of whatever small amount of honey was in it, the density of it, the way it fills the space in the stomach that has been empty for 2 days. He eats slowly, making the piece last, and then he goes to the ship's cook and asks for a bowl of pea soup, and the cook gives him one, and he sits on a coil of rope near the mast with the bowl in his hands and eats the soup and looks at the sea. The sea is calm today. The color of it is deep blue in the center where the water is deepest and lighter, almost green where the ship's shadow moves across it. The sun is high and the light is strong, and the sails above him are full, and the ship is moving well, and the pea soup in the bowl is thick and slightly salty, and tastes mostly of peas, with a faint undertone of the smoked pork that went into the water it was made from. And it is, at this moment, in this condition of grateful hunger, an entirely satisfying thing to eat. He stays on deck for a long time because the air is good and the light is good, and he is feeling better than he has felt since the ship left port, and he watches the crew go about their work, the ropes pulled and released and tied again, the sails adjusted as the wind shifts, the horizon watched by the man at the bow whose job it is simply to watch, to look at the sea ahead and report what he sees. Later in the afternoon, he eats a dried fig from his chest, sitting cross-legged on his sleeping mat below decks, with the hatch open above him to let in the light. The fig is dark and sweet and slightly tough, and he chews it for a long time, extracting every bit of the sweetness from it, because dried figs eaten slowly on a ship in the middle of the sea have a particular quality of luxury. They remind you that somewhere behind you, at the origin of this journey, there are trees that bear fruit in the heat and the sun, and that this small piece of darkness and sweetness was once fresh and hanging in the air of that warm place, and that it carries something of that place with it, even now, even here. The evenings on the ship are long and they end early, because there is very little to do once the light has gone and the fire cannot be lit for safety, and the ship's bell marks the hours of the watch and the hours of the off-watch sleep, and people go to their sleeping places when their watch ends and sleep when they can. He eats a small piece of the hard cheese before sleeping, sitting in the darkness below decks with the sound of the water against the hull all around him and the slight movement of the ship, a long, slow rolling that his body has accepted by now, and that has even taken on a quality of comfort, the way a hammock that seemed too unstable when you first lay in it becomes the thing you miss when you sleep in a fixed bed again. The cheese is sharp and firm and slightly salty, the good kind of saltiness that is not uncomfortable but simply there, and he eats it in small pieces and then takes a small sip of water from his cup and then he lies down, and the ship moves beneath him, and the stars, which he cannot see from where he is lying, but knows are there, arc slowly across the sky above the hull, and the sea makes its sound, which is like no other sound, and which once heard for enough nights becomes a kind of home. Now let us come back gently to the road. There is a kind of road that we have not yet visited, a winter road, which is different from all other roads in the ways that matter most to travelers. In the northern part of the world, in the depth of winter, travel was not something undertaken lightly. The roads were often deep in mud, half frozen, their surface unpredictable, soft where the sun had touched it briefly in the afternoon, and hard and rutted where it had frozen overnight. The cold was not the cold of early mornings in our first story, the kind you walk out of into a warming day. It was a cold that persisted, that sat in the air all day, that found the gaps in clothing and stayed there, that made the fingers numb by mid-morning and kept them numb until you were back inside by a fire. And yet people traveled in winter because necessity did not stop for weather. The winter traveler prepares differently from the summer traveler. The food they carry is chosen for warmth, or rather for what warmth can be wrung from it. Fat is more important in cold weather than in warm, because the body burns fat to maintain its temperature, and a traveler in deep cold who eats lean food will be cold regardless of how well wrapped they are. So the winter provisions include more pork fat, more lard, more of the dense, fatty cuts of preserved meat that in summer would seem heavy, but in winter feel like fuel, which is exactly what they are. Bread in winter is eaten in larger quantities because bread is carbohydrate, and carbohydrate is the most immediately accessible energy source the body has, and the body in cold weather burns through its carbohydrate reserves faster than in warm. A winter traveler might eat twice the bread of a summer traveler and still feel the cold by afternoon. Hot food becomes essential rather than simply pleasant. The midday stop in winter is not a rest under a tree. It is a stop wherever there is shelter, the side of a building, a low stone wall with a hedge behind it, the entrance to a barn if the farmer does not mind, or sometimes simply a hollow in the ground where the wind does not reach. And here, if the traveler is prepared, a small fire is lit. The small winter fire is a skill in itself. Wet wood does not light well, and winter wood is often wet. The experienced winter traveler carries dry tinder in a watertight case, a piece of metal-capped horn, or a small metal box sealed with wax, and this tinder is precious and protected. The fire is built from the driest material available, dry leaves scraped from under a hedge, dry twigs from the underside of a branch where the snow has not reached, small pieces of dry wood from inside a fallen log. It is started carefully with patience in a spot protected from the wind. Over this small fire, a small pot. The pot is the most important item in a winter traveler's kit. A clay pot is too heavy and too fragile. A metal pot, even a small one, is expensive but worth the expense if you travel in winter regularly, because the ability to heat food or water makes the difference between a journey that is merely difficult and one that is genuinely dangerous. Into the pot goes water from a flask and something that will dissolve or softens in water. a piece of the dried meat, or a handful of dried peas pre-softened overnight in a cloth bag of water carried inside the cloak against body heat, or simply a piece of salt pork and an onion, because even in winter onions were available. They kept for months in a cool root cellar, and a pork and onion broth. Even a thin one heated and drunk straight from the cup is one of the most efficient possible ways to warm a cold body from the inside. The traveler drinks the broth first, before eating anything solid, because hot liquid warms faster than solid food, going directly into the stomach where the body can use the warmth immediately. Then the solid pieces are eaten from the pot, the softened pork, the slices of onion, with the bread dipped into whatever remains of the liquid, the bread warming slightly from the liquid it absorbs, the fat from the pork, giving the whole thing a richness that is deeply, physically needed. The fire warms the hands and the face, while the broth warms the inside, and for a few minutes, at the base of the hedge with the snow perhaps lying in the field beyond, a traveler sitting beside their small fire with their small pot is in a manageable relationship with the cold. It is not comfortable exactly, but it is endurable, and it is nourished, and the road ahead is shorter than the road behind. After eating, the winter traveler does not rest as long as the summer traveler. In summer, resting after eating is practical. In winter, resting after eating quickly becomes cold, and cold quickly becomes dangerous, and the body's warmth that was restored by the broth and the fire begins to drain away within minutes of the fire being extinguished. So the winter traveler moves on before they would like to, packing the pot away still warm, lifting the bag onto cold shoulders, stepping back onto the road. The afternoon road in winter has a particular quality of light that is familiar to anyone who has spent time in northern countries in the dark months. The sun, when it is visible at all, does not climb high in the sky. It stays near the horizon all day, passing through its arc at a low angle, so that even at midday the light has the quality of late afternoon. The shadows long, the colors pale and slightly washed, the whole world looking as if it has been slightly diluted. This light does something to the experience of traveling that is hard to articulate but easy to feel. It makes the day feel shorter than it is, or rather, it makes the afternoon feel like it is already evening before it actually is. And this creates a particular urgency in the winter traveler, the urgency of wanting to reach the shelter before the real darkness comes, which in midwinter comes very early and comes fast, the pale afternoon light giving way to dusk in what seems like minutes. The last food of the afternoon in winter is eaten while walking, something to keep the body fueled as the cold deepens and the light falls. A piece of the pork fat, simply eaten from the fingers, a piece of hard cheese, a handful of dried plums from the bag. Small things, but each one adding its small amount to the ongoing calculation of keeping the body warm enough and fueled enough to reach the stopping place. And then the stopping place. The winter inn, when it is found, is not like the summer inn, or rather, it is the same building, but it feels entirely different. The warmth inside, when the door opens, is not just comfortable, but almost shocking in its contrast to the cold outside. And the smell of it, fire and food, and the warm animal smell of horses in the stable, and the particular smell of wood smoke mixed with bodies, and cooking is one of the most welcome combinations of sensations that a cold traveler can encounter. The fire in a winter inn is bigger. It is built up throughout the day and evening in a way that the summer fire is not, because the winter demands it, because the cold is always trying to get back in through the walls and the cracks around the doors, and the fire is the only thing standing between the warmth inside and the world outside. The fire in a winter inn is therefore a serious thing, tended carefully, never allowed to fall low, banked at night with ash to slow its burning and keep it alive until morning, restoked in the early hours so that it is burning well before the first traveler comes downstairs. The evening meal in a winter inn is heartier than its summer equivalent. The stew is thicker, made with more fat, more salt pork, more of the root vegetables that store through winter, the turnips and parsnips and beets that sit in the root cellars throughout the cold months and give up their substance slowly over the course of the winter, feeding the household and the travelers alike. There might be barley in the stew, which thickens it further and adds a satisfying chewiness to the mixture. There might be dried beans, softened and added to the pot in the afternoon, their starchiness contributing to the overall density of the dish. The bread is the same bread, hard crusted and dense, but in winter it is baked more often because people eat more of it, and so it is often fresher, the loaf on the table warm enough from this morning's baking that there is still a slight softness at its center, and this softness is noticed and appreciated by travelers who have been eating old bread for days. There is, in some winter inns, a particular dish that appears in the evening and that seems to be specifically designed for people who have been cold all day. A mixture of grain, usually oats or barley, and dried fruit cooked together in water or in milk if milk is available, until the grain is soft and the dried fruit has softened and released its sweetness into the mixture, and this is sweetened further with honey and perhaps flavored with a spice, cinnamon or cloves, which are expensive, but whose warmth is recognized as something more than flavor in cold weather, something that seems to warm the body from the inside in its own right. This dish is served warm, almost hot, in a deep clay bowl, and it is thick and sweet and slightly spiced, and after a day of cold road and cold food, it is almost unbearably good, the kind of simple food that becomes extraordinary by virtue of circumstance. The cold and the hunger and the relief of warmth, all combining to make a bowl of sweetened grain taste like something that belongs in a different category entirely from the same bowl of sweetened grain eaten on a warm summer morning. There is one more kind of long journey to visit, and we will visit it quietly, briefly, before we begin to settle toward the end of this long night. This journey is a pilgrimage. The pilgrim travels differently from the merchant, differently from the riverboat passenger, differently from the desert caravan. The pilgrim carries less, usually, because the ideal of the pilgrimage, in many traditions, involves a degree of voluntary poverty or simplicity, a giving up of comfort and convenience as part of the spiritual practice of the journey itself. Some pilgrims carried almost nothing, relying on the charity of people they passed and of the churches and monasteries along the route that maintained hostels and kitchens as specifically for pilgrims' use. The food given to pilgrims in these religious houses was, again, simple. It was designed not for pleasure, but for sustenance, the minimum required to keep the body capable of continuing the journey. Bread, always, soup or stew of whatever was available, water or mild ale. Nothing rich, nothing elaborate, nothing that would make the eating of it a distraction from the purpose of the journey. The pilgrim's relationship with this food was often quite different from the merchant's or the sailor's relationship with their food. For the pilgrim, hunger was not simply an inconvenience to be managed, but something with a meaning, a physical reminder of the purpose of the journey, a kind of teacher. To be hungry on the road and to receive a small bowl of soup from the hands of a monk or a lay brother at a monastery gate was to experience something that the pilgrim, who was eating well and carrying comfortable provisions, could not quite access. The particular quality of gratitude that comes from genuine need being genuinely met. This is not to romanticize hunger or poverty. It is simply to note that the pilgrim's experience of food along the route was colored by a framework of meaning that the merchant's was not, and that this changed how it tasted, or at least how it was received, and that the same bowl of lentil soup might be an entirely different experience, depending on what you brought to the eating of it. The pilgrim, arriving at dusk at a monastery gate, sometimes after days of eating very little, would be given soup and bread and a place to sleep, and would eat the soup in a refectory or a courtyard, or sometimes on the steps of the gate itself, and would eat it slowly, because hunger does not rush eating. Hunger tends to do the opposite, to slow it, to make every spoonful deliberate and recognized. The lentil soup is thin. There is a piece of bread that is the day's allowance, not large. There is water, and it is enough. And the pilgrim knows it is enough. And this knowing has a quality to it that is different from the satisfied knowing of the well-fed merchant who has eaten his fill at the inn. It is a starker, cleaner kind of satisfaction, the knowledge that the body has what it needs to continue tomorrow, carried in a bowl of thin soup and a piece of bread in the quiet of a monastery courtyard, with the evening prayers beginning somewhere inside the building, a sound that comes through the stone walls like something that belongs to the walls themselves. Not much changes in the courtyard. The light fades, but the soup cools. The pilgrim eats slowly. And now, quietly, we come back to where we began. The road, the traveler, the food. We have walked a long way in this night, through different centuries and different landscapes, from the dirt roads of northern Europe to the desert routes of the east, from the slow rivers to the open sea. We have followed merchants and their apprentices, women carrying dark cloaks and pickled vegetables, riverboatmen and their families, desert caravanners, scholars on ships, and pilgrims with empty pockets and full intentions. And through all of it, what has remained constant, what has appeared in every story and every landscape, is this: the body needing food and the food being found, and the act of eating being the most ordinary and the most essential thing a human being on a journey can do. There is something very peaceful about that constancy. In a world of great changes and uncertain futures, in times that were often harder and more difficult than our own, the meal at the end of the day happened. The porridge was made, the bread was torn, the soup was ladled into the bowl, and people sat down or stood or lay on the grass and ate and were sustained and rested and continued. This has been true for as long as there have been people on roads. Slowly, as we come to the end of this long journey, let us linger for a moment in one final scene. It is evening, and the season is neither fully summer nor fully autumn, that comfortable in between time when the days are still long enough to travel by, and the nights are cool enough to sleep well, when the harvest is either coming or has just been, and the food stored for winter has not yet been deeply drawn upon, and the world has the quality of fullness that comes in the time between abundance and preparation. A small group of travelers has stopped at the edge of a wood where a stream runs alongside the road, providing the clear water that they needed, and they have made a small fire, not a large one, not a cooking fire, but a companionship fire, the kind that says we are stopping here, and this place is ours for this evening. Someone has shared their bread. Someone else has brought out a soft cheese wrapped in cloth, softer than the hard cheeses of the road, a fresh cheese made from yesterday's milk, slightly tangy and white, the kind that does not last long, but that tastes entirely alive. There are apples, small and green-yellow, picked from a tree that overhung the road an hour back, the kind of wild apple that is too tart to eat in any quantity, but that has a freshness and a sharpness that the dry, preserved food of the road has not had for days. They sit around the fire. They eat slowly, passing the bread and the cheese, each person taking what they need and not more, the quiet courtesy of people who have learned to share. The stream makes its sound nearby, a very soft sound, watered over small stones, the kind of sound that changes pitch slightly as the wind passes through the trees above it, and the fire makes its crackling sound, and the evening birds have begun their short, late-day calling, and somewhere in the wood an owl that has started early is making its low sound into the gathering dark. The cheese is creamy and slightly sour and very good with the apple, the tartness of the apple cutting through the richness of the cheese, in the way that certain food combinations seem designed to work together, though no one here is thinking of it in those terms. They are simply eating and finding it good. The bread is yesterday's, firm and honest, and it holds the cheese well, and a piece of bread with cheese and a bite of apple, chewed slowly and swallowed slowly, is in this moment one of the simplest and most complete pleasures available to a human body. They do not talk much, or if they talk, the talking is soft, carried in the same register as the stream and the fire and the birds, not something that competes with these sounds, but something that moves among them. Slowly, the light continues to go. The fire gives off its warmth, which the cooler evening air requires, and the warmth of it on the face and hands has that particular quality of outdoor warmth that is different from the warmth of a room, surrounded as it is by the cool that lies just beyond the fire's reach, giving it a definition, an edge that makes it feel more present and more valued. Someone has a small bottle of something sweet, honey mead perhaps, or a light wine bought in the last town, and a little of it is poured into a cup that is passed around, just enough for a taste each, the sweetness of it rounding off the sourness of the apple and the tang of the cheese, and the cup passes from hand to hand around the fire with the same quiet courtesy as the bread. The fire settles. The wood that was crackling becomes coals that glow red and orange and do not crack but breathe. A slow, warm breathing that is the fire's last stage before it goes out entirely or is built up again. No one builds it up. There is enough warmth to last through the sitting, and sleep is coming, and sleep is better without a very bright fire, the darkness better for deep sleep. Very slowly now, let us begin to settle. The bread has been eaten, the cheese is gone, the apples are cores lying in the grass, which some creature of the night will find and eat before morning. The fire breathes its red breath, its glow the only light now, everything beyond it dark, the stream invisible but audible, the wood behind them a large, settled darkness, the sky above a deep, clear darkness with the first and brightest stars. The traveler lies back on their cloak. The ground beneath them is uneven, but not uncomfortable, the kind of unevenness that the body accepts and accommodates, finding the hollow that fits the hip, the rise that supports the shoulder. The wool of the cloak is thick and familiar and smells of the road, which is itself a comfort now, the smell of many days of travel contained in the fiber, the smoke of many fires, the cold of many mornings, the dust of many roads. The body is satisfied, not full in the way of an in-meal, not the deep satiation of a long evening of stew and bread and ale, but satisfied in a quieter way, the way of enough, of what was needed having been given, of the hunger that the long afternoon created having been gently and simply answered. This is the oldest satisfaction there is. The food of the road has always been this way, not abundant, not elaborate, not designed for pleasure, though pleasure often came from it, but designed for continuation, for the sustaining of a body that needed to continue, to keep moving through the world toward wherever it was going. The stream continues its sound. The fire breathes its last orange breaths. The stars, which have been arriving one by one since the light began to leave, are now fully present, the sky dense with them, the familiar ones and the unfamiliar ones, the ones that were used for navigation and the ones that were simply there, witnesses to the small fire and the sleeping travelers and the road that runs on into the dark in both directions, leading everywhere and nowhere, belonging to everyone and no one. Not much changes. The traveler's breathing slows. The day's walking settles into the muscles, the particular deep tiredness of a body that has done what it was made to do, that has moved through the world for many hours and eaten what it needed and rested where it could, and now is returning to the long quiet of sleep, where the food is processed and the muscles are repaired and the day is filed away in whatever part of the mind keeps such things. The last thought, before thought, gives way to something slower and less particular, is of the road ahead, not with anxiety, not with anticipation, but with the simple knowledge that it is there, that tomorrow it will be walked, that tomorrow there will be porridge at an inn, and dried meat in a bag, and at midday perhaps a tree, and bread and cheese, and in the evening a fire, and a bowl of something hot, and that this will be enough, as it has always been enough, as it was enough for every person who ever traveled a road and ate a meal along the way, from the very first road to this one. The fire breathes, the stream speaks, the stars turn slowly, very slowly, and the night holds everything in its large, quiet hands, and the long journey continues as it always has toward morning.